Hello there, Ben Bowes, the Spirit Specialist, and you are watching the video that accompanies the exclUSives or US exclUSives sample selection box that I put together following my trip, which includes those 6 samples there. My recent vacation to Florida, which was long delayed thanks to the COVID pandemic, but we finally managed to get out there, spend some time at Disney World with my family, had an absolute blast. And while I was out there, I decided I was going to pick up some bottles to potentially sell to some customers. And I found a 6 sort of interesting, slightly unusual, relatively unknown bottles while I was out there, and I thought, well, rather than sell them to one individual, why not decant them into sample packs and let a number of people try them? So here we are. We have the exclusive sets, which you may well be looking at right now, or you might just want to watch the video and see what I think of these particular 6, because it may have already sold out. But what the plan is with this is I've put the samples in the box in a sort of running order. So I did think about doing an actual tasting event, but online tasting events, it means that everybody's got to get there at the same time, whereas this is a way of people being able to kind of buy it, drink it whenever they want, watch the video at the time they're drinking it. And if you're wanting to do sort of one on one night, one on another night, or completely mix up the order, what I will do is in the show notes, I will put the time so you can click directly to, and YouTube should just then send you straight to the particular sample that you're drinking. Because what I'm going to do is give you a bit of background information about the sort of distillery, the brand itself, like I do with most of my video reviews, and then just quickly kind of have a little nip myself and kind of give you my thoughts. But you know, ultimately that's my thoughts, not yours, so you know, don't let that sway you in terms of what you think of it. Now, obviously, these aren't available for sale in the UK yet. They may well be, and one of them I have already contacted the brand to see if they are looking at UK distribution, because I think it's absolutely fantastic. But if you are over in the States and you've tried these and you think, oh, actually, I'm going to pick up a bottle myself, then at least you know what it's like. And if you're not managing to get to the States, you've tried some things that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to try. So the first one is Walking Stick Single Barrel Bourbon, and this was actually recommended to me by one of the staff members, one of the managers at the ABC liquor stores in Lake Buena Vista. Very ordinary looking label, and he said, actually give it a go, and I did a little bit of research, and I'm glad I did pick it up. So here is a bit of background information about Walking Stick itself.
Walking Stick Single Barrel Bourbon was quietly added to the Buffalo Trace range of whiskies in 2015, but unfortunately there is very little concrete information about the brand, and a variety of sources claim the spirit is actually produced at the Barton 1792 distillery in Bardstown. Both Buffalo Trace and Barton distilleries are owned by Sazerac, so this certainly seems like it could well be the case. The bottle label itself offers very little detail, just stating it was bottled by the founder's company Louisville, which is indeed a subsidiary name used by Sazerac, so let's just say 2 + 2 = 4, and this is a single barrel release from Barton. The mash bill and age are unknown, but it's reckoned the liquid averages around 5 years old, although being a single barrel release, this potentially will be different for each batch bottled. However, there's no mention of batch numbers and so on as you might find on other single barrel releases such as Blanton's. Walking Stick Single Barrel Bourbon is bottled at 90 US proof or 45% ABV.
Okay, so it doesn't look like much from the outside, but actually the pedigree behind it is pretty damn decent. So I'm going to have a very small bit because it's quite early in the morning. It's chucking it down outside, so you know, this is going to bring me back to my holiday mode. But yeah, very little information on the bottle. So 96 proof, single barrel, 96, 90 proof even, 45 ABV, and on the back, as I said, bottled by the founder's company Louisville, Kentucky. That's it. Then there's the government warning. There is no information on this at all. Nothing to suggest that this is anything to do with Buffalo Trace, with Barton, that sort of thing. So on the nose, classic bourbon characters. There's a nice bit of heat, and it noses for me a little bit stronger than 45. I wouldn't maybe put it necessarily as high as 50, but there's a little bit more heat in there. There's a nice touch of dry spice, kind of like dried chili flakes, cracked black pepper. It feels like it's on that drier side. You know, it feels to me like there's kind of a high rye content coming in here. Now the mash bill, unfortunately, we don't know, but Instantly on the nose, I'm kind of thinking, well, this could well be a high rye bourbon. On the palate, a little bit softer initially. When it comes in, there's a nice kind of that vanilla, slightly toffee feel to it, and then the spice comes through on the second half. And that balance that's on the nose of that kind of like chili flake black pepper is there. It's not too spicy, but it does have a bite to it. And I think that's helped by the 45% ABV too. I think that little higher ABV without going too overpowering really does accentuate the spiciness that's there. It's a really classic bourbon style, and it's one where, as an introduction to bourbon, I think it's got all that kind of elements of, it's got the vanilla, it's got that kind of salted caramel feel, but it's got that spiciness. I'm really intrigued to know what the mash bill is. I wish there was some more information about it, but this really is a kind of like a unknown brand name that, just doing a bit of digging, that's literally as much as I can get out. There's the fact that it was released by Buffalo Trace, it's owned by Sazerac, but it seems to be common consensus is that it's Barton rather than Buffalo Trace itself. Well, it ticks a lot of boxes for what is a bourbon like. What does bourbon taste like? You get that hit of spice, but it's not too drying. You get the vanilla character. You get a slight kind of almost a milk chocolatey feel to it. It really is a sort of classic flavor profile. It doesn't have anything particularly outstanding about it, but it is very well made. And it's one of those where you kind of look at it and go, I don't think much of that. The labeling has actually changed. If you Google walking stick bourbon, the labeling before this, which is the latest version, is probably even more boring than that, believe it or not. So it doesn't look like much from the outside, but what there is inside is actually really, really good. Okay, so the next, as I've lined it up in the box, okay, so the next, as I have it lined up in the box, is this little beauty, which is Woodson bourbon whiskey. Now this was actually, the reason I've got this is because my wife, we were looking on the shelves in the liquor stores, and she spotted that and she went, oh, I really like that label. Now, she tends to go for labels and bottle styles, but admittedly, so do I. But she really liked this, and she was like, oh, get this one, it sounds interesting. And kind of looked at it and went, oh, I wonder who Charles Woodson is. Yeah, let's give it a go. You know, aged in wine, finished in wine barrels. I was really intrigued by the fact it says aged 6 months accelerated aging. So I've done a bit of digging, and let me give you a bit more information about Woodson whiskey.
Woodson Bourbon is named after Charles Woodson, a cornerback and safety who played in the NFL for 18 years with the Oakland Raiders and the Green Bay Packers, even winning the Super Bowl. To date, he's the only defensive player to win the Heisman Trophy, an annual award for the most outstanding player in college football. Woodson had a keen interest in wine and winemaking during his playing years, releasing his own wine brand in the early 2000s, despite the NFL preventing him from publicly endorsing it due to their alcohol policies. Following his retirement, Woodson continued winemaking and in late 2021 branched out into craft spirits, using his Cabernet Sauvignon wine barrels to finish off a bourbon whiskey that had undergone accelerated aging through the use of ultrasonic waves. The waves increase agitation and interaction between cut-up barrel staves and the spirit in a stainless steel tank, so after only 6 months, the whiskey is then bottled. Woodson Bourbon is bottled at 80 US proof or 40% ABV.
Okay, so pretty cool story behind the brand itself in terms of Charles Woodson and kind of what he's done. Really interesting reading about the fact that he was wanting to do this wine brand, and basically the NFL, they didn't stop him completely, but they really deterred him from physically, personally endorsing his own wine brand because of the policies that the NFL have in terms of advertising alcohol, being involved in alcohol. So this uses this accelerated aging process, which is, and this is something that we're going to touch on later on in another one, but this particular accelerated aging process is ultrasonic waves. And American whiskey very much is, there's quite a few brands and companies out there that are looking at these ways of being able to age whiskey quicker than just having it sat in a barrel, and trying to accentuate and increase the interaction between the spirit and the wood, and not necessarily sitting within a barrel, but putting the barrel and the spirit in a tank and trying to get it to interact constantly more than you would do with it just sat there for a few years. So this also has the finish of Woodson's own wine barrels, which are, I believe, Cabernet Sauvignon barrels. So it doesn't really pick up on the bottle in terms of the colour, interestingly enough. So, you know, 6 months old whiskey, and I don't know how long the finish is. I'm assuming a month, maybe. It might not even be as long as that, considering there's not that much of a kind of hue coming through from the wine barrels. Anyway, on the nose, there's a sort of hay feel to it. It's not sharp on the nose, but there is a light sort of, not grassy, it's more like dry hay, but there is a definite sort of wheaty nose on it. So I'm wondering, the mash bill, I've lost my notes now, but I can't remember what the mash bill is of this, but there is a definite lighter touch. You know, having had this directly after the walking stick felt more softer, more of that vanilla note, and then the spiciness. There's less of a spice, and there's definitely more of a lighter kind of grassy stroke hay touch to it. There's not as much spice as there is, but it's definitely light and fresh. And on the palate, again, the same. It's quite light, quite delicate, quite fresh. I'm getting a citrusy note coming through, which is really wasn't expecting for a bourbon finished off in wine barrels. There's a fruitiness there, but it's not as I would expect, like red berries. It's more sort of slightly citrusy, and now I'm starting to get a red berry feel, but it's more like summer fruits, like strawberries and raspberries, not cherries and plums and dark fruits, which is what I tend to associate with red wine finished whiskies. So it's a lot lighter. So it's a really light, slightly delicate, quite fresh whiskey. Very, very pleasant, and that fruitiness actually develops on the finish. It's starting to come through more. And now on the nose, I'm starting to pick up a little bit more of that fruitiness. But again, it's light fruit. So yeah, I do get a touch of citrus, almost like lemon curd. And then it's strawberries and raspberries, and maybe a touch of cherry, but a very light cherry. It's almost refreshing. It's very, very pleasant and quite different to the walking stick. But strangely, those wine barrels haven't had the effect that I thought that they would. I thought it was going to give it more of a dark red fruit influence, but actually it's quite light. And I could be wrong, because I've only read in a couple of places, it's not official that these are his Cabernet Sauvignon, but it would almost suggest to me with that light fruitiness that actually these are Pinot Noir casks that have been used for finishing. It's got that light red berry feel that I associate with lighter red wines, like a Pinot Noir, not the heavier side. Really, really easy to drink. Maybe not quite enough body for some people who prefer their whiskies with a bit more intensity. This is more like a kind of a spring-summer bourbon. I could really imagine drinking this kind of lightly chilled, or actually mixing it in a long drink. Very, very pleasant indeed, and really, really interesting to kind of see what's happening with a winemaker that then is then moving into craft spirits. So the next, let's cut that. So the next whiskey that we have in the box is Nelson's Green Brier Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. Now this was actually a bottle that my dad found. And a bit like my wife, he just really liked the label, he liked the look of it, and ended up going, why don't you get this one? Was intrigued by it, and to be honest, I'm not much of a Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey fan. I don't know whether it's just a subconscious association with Jack Daniels, but it was kind of like, well, it looks interesting. Did a bit of reading up on it, and actually thought the history of this was really, really interesting. It's a distillery that actually predates Jack Daniels. So I've done a bit of research, and before I tell you what I think of the taste, let me give you a bit of background information about the distillery itself.
The Greenbrier Distillery in Robertson County, Tennessee, operated from 1867 to 1909, when state prohibition laws closed it down. It was acquired by Charles Nelson in 1870, 5 years before the Jack Daniels distillery was founded, and by 1885 it was one of the biggest whiskey producers in the entire state. After closure, whiskey from the distillery made prior to that continued to be sold until 1915, and in 1923 the distilling equipment was shipped to Canada by Seagram's. In 2011, two of Charles's great-great-great-grandsons, Charlie and Andy, announced plans to revitalise the distillery. While waiting on permits and equipment to open their own base, the pair sourced whiskies and released them under the Belle Meade name, a branding originally used by Nelson's. And in 2014, the new Brier distillery opened in Nashville. The Tennessee Sour Mash whiskey has a mash bill of corn, wheat and malted barley, although the proportions are not divulged. Being a Tennessee whiskey, the spirit undergoes filtration through maple charcoal before being aged in charred virgin oak casks, with an age anywhere between 2 to 5 years. It's bottled at 91 US proof or 45.5% ABV.
Right, so this is technically a new distillery, a very new distillery, but its basis is on a very old distillery. And I read quite an interesting review for this one, which said it had very, very good things to say about it, but it said one of the issues that this has as a distillery is this is literally 4, 5, 6 years old. It's a very new distillery, and other Tennessee distilleries, the likes of Jack Daniel's, that are well established and have that kind of Tennessee Sour Mash branding sewn up. You know, Tennessee Sour Mash for a lot of whiskey drinkers is Jack Daniel's, is they have years of operation to develop and evolve and finesse their product and their flavour profile. Whereas Brier is essentially having to start again. So they are still technically finding their feet. So although the history of the distillery is that, you know, there's a lot of integrity behind it, because this is a revitalized, relaunched new distillery, even though it's, you know, been going for a few years, this still has to find its feet. So you can't really kind of go, oh, is it better than Jack Daniel's because the distillery is older? The branding's older. Yes, the history behind it is older. You know, the original Brier predates Jack Daniel's. But the whiskey in this bottle has less time to have kind of got its finesse, and also aging as well. You know, they don't have 10, 15-year-old spirit that they can put in to kind of, you know, create more of a complexity. So bear that in mind while we are trying this. On the nose, a bit like the Woodson, I'm getting a bit of a hay feel here. Sort of dry hay. There's a bit more of a grassiness. There's a bit of vanilla coming through as well. A touch of sea salt too. There's a slight saline element to it on the nose. Again, nose is quite youthful. It's quite sprightly on the nose. It's quite almost effervescent. Kind of a real sourdough and a sour sourdough bread note to it as well. Okay, on the palate. A very specific 45.5% on this as well. That it's got that sourdough note that I associate with Tennessee whiskies, and a touch of that foam bananas, but there's also a little drying element on the finish, which if I didn't know anything about the whiskey, I'd almost go, oh, actually it's slightly tannic. You know, does this have some kind of red wine? This is almost the finish that I would have expected on the Woodson, which has that red wine finish. There's a slightly drying, slightly tannic note to it as well, but this is virgin American oak casks. And I think that's just the youthfulness of it, as well as that slightly higher ABV, that 45.5%. It doesn't quite have the vanilla notes that you would expect from a bourbon, because Tennessee whiskey, you know, that maypole, it's not a maypole. It's, you know, they're not dancing around it with frilly things on and hitting things with sticks. For Americans will have no idea what I was talking about on there. Maple charcoal filtration. I'm not sure how much effect that has on the flavour, whether it actually introduces a flavour profile, but definitely Tennessee whiskey seems to have less of that vanilla, softer caramel note that I associate with bourbons. It tends to be, there's a bit more bite to it. It's not metallic, but there is a bit more of an edge to that flavour profile. It's kind of there on the nose. It's not quite metallic, but it's definitely edgier. And then on the palate, you do get a touch of almost like banana peel. There is a banana-iness, and it's what I also get from the Daddy Rack, which is another Tennessee whiskey, and it is there with Jack Daniel's. Tennessee whiskies, for me, tend to have a note of banana. And on here, I think because of the youthfulness, it's a bit more of a banana peel note as well. But actually very, very drinkable. For something so young and for something that's technically still developing, as this review that I read, which I kind of understand and I get what they're trying to say, it still has a lot going for it. There is a lot of character here and it's very, very pleasant. Is it better than Jack Daniels? Right now, I don't think it is, but I think it's as good. I think it's as interesting. I think Jack Daniels, bog standard Jack Daniels, is underrated because of the power of its branding. You know, when I did a Dram a Day a few years ago, and I went back to Jack Daniels after not drinking it for 10, 15 years, just on principle, it was better than I thought it was going to be because it is a decent whiskey. There's a reason it's so popular. I don't think this is better. I think it's got slightly more interesting things going for it. And I think if you like Jack Daniels, you will absolutely like this. And it's essentially whether you like the label or not as to whether you're really going to go for it. But it's very drinkable. I'd be really interested to see how it develops as a brand. And it will also be interesting to see whether they keep this historical note for it, because this is very old school and this is a little bit niche. And I am half expecting at some point in the future, maybe not the near future, but at some point in the future, there will be a rebranding where this gets refined slightly. As far as I'm aware, this is based on the original labels. And I think it's a bit of a risk for them to do that because there are some people that look at labels like that and go, oh, that's been sat on the shelf for ages. Nobody's buying it. It can't be that good. It literally is as simple as that. But as with anything, the label does nothing for the flavor. It's the liquid inside that makes the difference. And I really like this. I think it's very, very drinkable. I've got even more of a banana note coming through on that one and a touch of nuts as well. Sort of like banana nut bread almost. Oh, actually that last one was even better than it was before. I've got a little bit left in there. I might have to have a drop of that later on. But yeah, lots going on with it. And actually that last little mouthful that I had where it had banana and nuts, almost like pecan nuts, and it's sort of like a brown bread. It's like a banana nut bread that's all mixed together. Offers a lot more than the likes of Jack Daniels does. And if they can push that, you know, if it gets a little bit older and it starts bringing those flavors a little bit more together, that could be something really, really special. So the next one we have on the list is the Amador Whiskey Company Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey, finished in Chardonnay barrels, which is really quite unusual. But before I tell you what it tastes like, let me give you a bit of background information about the brand itself.
In 1947, John and Mario Trinchero purchased the Sutter Home Winery in the Napa Valley, moving across from New York City and growing an impressive portfolio of wine brands. In 2012, the company branched out into whiskey production, working with a number of distilleries such as Barton 1792 and Willett to source whiskies which could then be finished in their own wine barrels. However, it's important to note that this is not linked to the Amador and Dry Diggings distillery, which is also based in California but are producing their own spirit. Initially, Amador launched with two bottlings. The 10 barrel was a hop flavoured whiskey, whereas the initial double barrel was a high rye bourbon finished in Cabernet Sauvignon casks. However, this is a second double barrel release of a wheated bourbon from the Willett Distillery in Bardstown, with a mash bill of 65% corn, 20% wheat and 15% malted barley, which has been aged for 3 years in virgin American oak casks before a finish of 9 to 12 months in Chardonnay wine barrels, which is somewhat unusual for the whiskey market. There is also a rye whiskey finished in port casks. Amador Double Barrel Wheated Bourbon is bottled at 86 US proof or 43% ABV.
So this was one where I kind of went, oh, I quite like the label on this. I'm a bit of a sucker for the label. And then the fact it was finished in Chardonnay barrels, I found really, really interesting. Now they do talk, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see, I didn't actually mention it in my blurb, but they do talk about the 38th latitude, which is essentially a line between Kentucky and California. So you might be able to see it straight across from there. But it was more like Chardonnay barrels. That was what caught my eye. Plus I thought, oh, it looks quite interesting as well. Then did the research on it and found out about it being from the company that owns Sutter Home, Trinchero Estates. And I've been really struggling to say the word Trinchero because it's just too many sounds going on in one go. But 86 proof, 43% ABV. So it says it's a small batch bottling, which is kind of meaningless. But what we do have here is Willett bourbon, that's been finished off in theirs. Now, creates flavors of vanilla, brown sugar, roasted nuts, and a creamy mouthfeel. Enjoying your favorite old-fashioned, Manhattan, or Boulevardier. This apparently is, not sure if you can see that on the label, batch number 1, bottled in January, February, March, April, May 2021. Case number 2171, supposedly. Anyway, so the reason I've put the samples in a lineup in the box as is I took a little nip from each, and I was trying to consider, if you are having a tasting and we're doing a tasting event and you're trying all 6, you don't want the one previously to affect the one that you've had afterwards. And this was a real tricky one to kind of where to put it in. And you'll find out why once you've tried it. On the nose, there's a real touch of sweetness, and it really reminds me of barley sugar, of all things. There's the vanilla note that you would expect from bourbon, but there's another underlying sweetness that isn't vanilla. It's more slightly sugary, and it's like barley sugar. There's not a lot of spice on it. There's not that kind of dry spice that you might associate with, you know, a sort of high rye bourbon. And on this, we have no rye whatsoever. We've got corn, wheat, barley. So you don't have that spicy element, and it's softer and it's slightly sweeter as well. And then on the palate, initially really quite sweet. And I really do think that's that Chardonnay element coming through, because there are very few white wine barrel finished whiskies, because it's a very hard, the ones I've had, to be honest, the ones that are good are very much in a minority. I've not had many, and the ones that I have had in the majority tend to be, it just doesn't work. And I've had very few Chardonnay barrel finished whiskies as well. Glenmorangie is probably the biggest name that did a Chardonnay finish, and it was awful. Now, Glenmorangie is quite a light single malt Scotch whisky anyway, and it tasted like you had a glass of wine and there was a little bit of wine left and you just added some Glenmorangie in. The wine and the whiskey just did not combine together. The dryness, that kind of like dry oakiness of the white wine, just did not work with the softer feel of a whiskey. And here, if you told me this was a white wine finish, but what wine is it? I would not necessarily go for Chardonnay, because the sweetness that's in there, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, this is probably the sweetest of the lot. The last one is pretty sweet, but in a different way. But I would probably go, right, white wine finish on this, maybe Sauterne. It's got sweetness of a dessert wine. And it's only really on the finish that the nuttiness comes through, that you then sort of associate with the kind of buttery oakiness of a Chardonnay. Now, Californian Chardonnay, and Chardonnay is one of those weird wines that as a sort of a bottle of wine, you can get really, really oaky, very buttery, but then really oaky, chewing on the end of a pencil Chardonnay, or it can go really dry and you could almost mistake it for a Sauvignon Blanc. It's a very weird grape, and when I was working for Oddbins, what we're looking at 20 years ago, Chardonnay was all about that big buttery oaky kind of like Australian Chardonnay that, you know, really rich and creamy and full, but really woody as well. Californian Chardonnay did go down that route, and it seems to have kind of just got a little bit more refined. So you get a bit of butteriness to it, but it's not too in your face. And I'd love to try the wine that was in the barrels before this whiskey went in, because I don't think it's too full on. I guess it's quite a light Chardonnay that has a bit of a buttery mouthfeel, but not too intense, and it's not too oaky, because you do get a slight nuttiness coming through, but it's not overly dry, and it's not overly fighting the whiskey element that's in there as well. This is a really interesting, really unusual bourbon as a whole. There's a lot going on in here, and I can imagine this isn't necessarily going to work for some people, because the first half on the palate is very much a whiskey that's slightly sweet. And then the Chardonnay element more comes through on the end. It starts to get a little bit drier, but you get those lighter, higher notes of a white wine rather than the berry notes of a red wine. And I don't think that's necessarily going to work for some people. which I genuinely believe is why you don't get many white wine finished whiskies, because it's two flavor profiles that don't really complement each other that well, and it's quite hard to make them work together. This just about gets away with it, but I think for some people it still won't. I think this is really interesting. Okay, so it turned out that my phone ran out of storage, mainly because of the multitude of pictures that I'd taken while we were on vacation. So it cut out midway through me talking, basically finishing off about Amador. But before it cut out, and I was midway through a sentence, I was essentially saying that the disparate nature of the Chardonnay cast with the whiskey might not work for some, just because it's slightly more unusual. It's not a natural fit in terms of flavour, but I do think it works really well. But it might be that the port bourbon or rye, there is a rye, there is the other bourbon as well. One of them's finished in port casks. Yeah, so the bourbon, double barrel bourbon was Cabernet Sauvignon casks, and then there's a rye whiskey that's with port casks. That's a more natural fit in terms of sort of cask finishing and whiskey. So I'd be really interested to try those. So when I do go back out, which is potentially going to be next year by the way that it's looking, but I do think I'll probably try one, if not both, of the other two that they've got out now, because I do like this and I think it's got a lot going for it, and I think that maybe I might even prefer the port and the Cabernet Sauvignon versions better. But it's certainly really, really interesting to try, and it would be good to know what your thoughts are. So the next in the box was the Cleveland Underground bourbon whiskey finished in black cherry wood. Now, I was already aware of what Cleveland were doing. The Cleveland Distillery, although as you'll find out, they don't really want to be called the Cleveland Distillery. And they do have three versions of this black bourbon whiskey finished in, there's maplewood, there's applewood, and there's black cherry wood. And I was really interested in the black cherry one particularly, because I thought that out of the three of them could work really, really well. So before I tell you what this tastes like and my impressions of it, let me give you a bit of background information on the brand itself.
Cleveland Whiskey don't like to call themselves a distillery, but a disruptive technology company. While founder Tom Licks accepts the majority of flavour in whiskey does come from maturation with wood, he strongly believes that new techniques can be used to extract flavour from transformative woods that otherwise would be unusable as a traditional barrel due to its porosity, applewood, maplewood and black cherry wood for example. So in 2009, Tom engineered a pressure aging process whereby a barrel of the wood in question briefly holds some new make distillate before being chopped up and added to a tank with that same liquid. Alternating between high and low pressures in the tank forces the spirit in and out of the wood, drawing out colour and flavour in much less time than static aging would. It's certainly a controversial technique, with old school drinkers and producers horrified at the lack of respect for tradition and history, but Cleveland are winning awards and growing sales rapidly. The black cherry wood finish features a mash bill of 75% corn, 21% rye and 4% malted barley. It's bottled at 94 US proof or 47% ABV.
So, as I said, disruptive technology, and Cleveland are pretty controversial in the whiskey market because Tom has no kind of like apology for what he's doing, but he really, really strongly believes in it. And this is the first opportunity that I'd had to actually try the whiskey itself. So colour-wise, not quite as dark as I thought it may be, but having said that, we are looking at sort of not very old whiskey at all, you know, barely months by the sounds of it. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I don't think it's even 6 months. So on the nose, there is a definite fruitiness on there as well, but there is that youthfulness, that sort of sprightly vigour, and there is a woodiness to it, but underlying that there is certainly a dark fruit character. Now I'm not sure I'd go as sort of specific as cherry, but there is a red fruit note to it. We are looking at 47% ABV as well, so you do get a bit of that heat from the alcohol, but there is a fruitiness there. Now this is obviously black cherry wood, it's not cherries, it's not a cherry flavoured whiskey, so you know it's not going to be quite as obviously fruity as you might expect from a cherry flavoured whiskey, but there is something going on in there which is a red berry influence. On the palate, it feels a little bit tight. The fruitiness is still there, but it feels like it needs to open out a little bit. Now, I've not got any water with me, and it might be that you want to add just a little drop or two, just to kind of soften it down a little bit. I could, if I could be bothered, pause, go and get some water, put a drop in. But I'm just going to keep drinking this neat, and I'll let you kind of get on with it and decide. And let me know, if you put a couple of drops of water in, maybe just to knock it down. Maybe it is a case of they bottle it slightly too high, because it feels a little bit tight. It feels like there's some fruity characters in there. That red fruit that's on the nose is there on the palate, but it still feels as though it's kind of being held back by the alcohol content. It feels like it just needs to open out just a touch to release a bit more of that red berry note. Because what's there I really, really like. And it does feel like it's got that kind of like slightly winey influence, even though there's no wine casks involved. I like this. I just feel like I could like this more if it just opened up. And it feels like it's one that is too young, but that is in its nature. Now, considering the technology that's gone into this and the processes that are involved, and actually considering how very, very young this is, even though I don't know specifically, say a couple of months, say this is like the equivalent of say 3 months old. It's really, really impressive, the depth of flavour that's in there for something so, so young. I just wish it had a little bit more complexity to it. It feels like if this was, for example, say a 3-year-old bourbon, a 3-year-old standard age bourbon, it spent 3 years in a black cherry wood cask, I'd almost be thinking, I wish this was 4 or 5 years old, just to open up a little bit more. And maybe I'm kind of doing it a disservice, and you might have added a little drop of water to it and found that actually, Ben, that is enough to really open those fruity flavours out, because I love the dark kind of fruit notes that are coming through with it. I wouldn't, again, as with the nose, I wouldn't say specifically cherry, but there is a lovely dark red berry note in here that I really, really enjoy, and I love with whiskies. And I think this has plenty going for it. So bearing in mind the sort of the story behind the production process of this is really, really impressive. It's just, it feels like there's another level to it, but I don't know if Tom and the Cleveland gang can reach that next level in terms of kind of opening up that complexity and developing it. I don't know if they can reach that level with the processes that they've got in play, because I don't know whether just leaving it in the tank with the high and low pressure for longer will give you more flavour. Doing a bit of reading about it, they do talk about the fact that the process that they use gives you much more consistency. You kind of know what you're going to get as an end result. You're not relying on the sort of vagaries of a cask sat there for a couple of years that might work and might not. By doing this process, they're finding they're getting a lot more consistency. What I don't know is whether they're able to kind of play around with that process, that high and low pressure, slow it down or speed it up or do it for longer, whether they'll get more complexity out of it. Because for me, it feels like this is where the whiskey is. It's good, but it could be there if it kind of almost went into another cask and finished for, say, 6 months. Wouldn't take long. But I think it's a spirit it's a flavour profile in a whiskey that it needs an extra something that I don't think they can actually do because of the processes that they use. And it's just, that's what they do, and this is what the whiskey is going to taste like. So this is a really good whiskey. I really do like that flavour profile. I really like the fruitiness that's coming off it. I'm starting to get some brown sugar notes coming through, almost like caramelised brown sugar. But there is a bite, there is not a harshness, not an astringency to it, but it feels tight, it feels like it's holding flavours back. That if it was softened ever so slightly, this would tick even more boxes from me. This is definitely on the sweeter side. And you do get a warm, dark red fruit note to it, which does kind of associate with that black cherry wood. So it really does kind of give what it offers on the label. I just wish it gave a little bit more, and I'm not sure if they can. So do let me know what you think if you've added some water to this. I do have a little bit left, so what I might do is a bit later on, just not for the video, I might try a little bit more just with a drop of water to see if it really improves. So the final one in the box and this was the one that I was most kind of excited about in terms of like, it was a little bit different, was Rattlesnake Rosie's Maple Bacon Whiskey. Now I picked this up off the shelf, looked at it, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I kind of like the label as well. Sounds good, you know, there's loads of flavoured whiskies in America as well. Peanut butter whiskey in particular. Peanut butter is the thing at the moment. So over in the UK, we have Sheepdog, which I have on the shelf. But the biggie over in the States is Screwball. But there is now essentially in most liquor stores a peanut butter whiskey section. And even while I was in ABC on the 192 in Kissimmee, was having a chat with the assistant manager there and kind of stood at the till paying for various bits and pieces and talking about the fact that, you know, there seems to be a lot of peanut butter whiskey. Flavoured whiskey is a big thing in America anyway, as you would expect. But peanut butter whiskey is very much it. And literally, as we were having the conversation about the fact that, oh, you know, I've got Sheepdog, I see you've got a miniature of Screwball, I'll pick one of those up because I wouldn't mind trying it. Screwball's quite expensive compared to the rest of the peanut butter whiskies. It's like it's a premium peanut butter whiskey. But we were literally having the conversation about how peanut butter whiskey is the thing at the moment, like very, very popular in America. The door pings, a couple walk in the mid-50s, and the wife turns around and says, oh, hi there, yeah, can you tell me where your peanut butter whiskies are? And that was what they were coming into the store for. So I've already got a peanut butter whiskey on the shelf. I wasn't going to pick a peanut butter whiskey because we have one over here and I quite like Sheepdog. There's peach, there's apple pie flavoured whiskey. There's quite a lot of apple and apple pie whiskies, which is sort of the next one on the rung of popularity of flavoured. And then peach does seem to be a thing. But maple bacon, and I love maple syrup and I love bacon, so it was like, ooh, let's give this a go. So you might have poured it already, and you might notice that there are bits in it. They are supposed to be in there, but I didn't realise there were bits in it until I started decanting these bottles. So you might be thinking, maple bacon, and it might be a case of you going, oh, well, actually, I'm vegan or I'm vegetarian, so I'm not actually sure I can have this. Well, before I give you my little tasting notes on this, let me tell you about Rattlesnake Rosie's Maple Bacon Whiskey.
Based in Fairport, New York, the Iron Smoke Distillery was founded in 2011 by rock singer Tommy Brunette and master distiller Drew Westcott. Plenty of apples are grown in upstate New York, so alongside the Iron Smoke bourbons, which are made using a 4-grain mash bill of corn, rye, wheat and barley, the team created Rattlesnake Rosie as a brand name for flavoured releases, the first being an apple pie version. This maple bacon bottling came next, using maple syrup from a local farm, but the bacon flavour is actually created using a specific type of yeast, so no animal product is used in the spirit and nothing artificial is added either, meaning it's still suitable for vegans. It's bottled at 70 US proof or 35% ABV.
So I took a punt on this one. I didn't actually try this before we got back home and I opened them to decant them into the sample packs. So I didn't realise that it was full of bits, but the bits are supposed to be there because I've been in touch, and this is basically kind of like, they don't filter it at all. But as I told you in my little background information, there is no meat product used in this at all. And I'm already getting a whiff of this and it smells absolutely amazing. So this is local maple syrup, and then a specific type of yeast that they use to produce the whiskey that gives it a bacony flavour. So it's completely natural. There's no artificial flavourings that are added to this. Maple syrup's used, but there's no meat products either. So it's absolutely suitable for vegans and everything like that. So very cool bottle. I really do like the kind of old school style. Went onto the Iron Smoke Distillery website. Tommy Brunette is like a proper American rocker as well. He's like, I've never heard of the guy before, but you know, he's toured a lot, and he basically, if you read the blurb about him and about Iron Smoke, his idea was to merge two classic things of America, rock and roll and whiskey. And it's like, yeah, okay. But I am really intrigued to then go back to America or somehow try and get hold of Iron Smoke bourbon, because I'm really, really impressed with this. Spoiler alert, I think this is really good. So on the nose, there's a brilliant combination of that sweet maple syrup. And maple syrup can sometimes, a bit like honey, can sometimes go a bit overly sweet and a little bit sickly, or it can be quite light. And you get that sweet maple note, but it's actually still quite light and delicate and almost floral. And you get that along with very much a barbecuey smokiness that's not too intense, but it leads the maple syrup into that meaty note of what would be bacon, but like a bacon on the barbecue, or bacon how I like it, which is, some people will say, is overcooked. When I have a bacon sandwich, if you've got a bacon sandwich and it's got the fat on the outside and that fat is not like proper charred, you end up having to peel it off. I don't like chewy fat on bacon, so I like my bacon like overcooked, and that's why I kind of like bacon over in the States, where it's that streaky bacon where half of it's fat, but they really overcook it so the whole thing is really crispy. Love crispy bacon. There's a lovely flow from initially maple syrup to smoke to bacon. It's brilliantly done, and it's a sort of aroma that like comes out of the glass and you can smell it in the room. It really is fantastic. On the palate, very sweet, possibly too sweet for some. Starts off sweet, brown sugar, maple, that syrupy feel. Then smokiness comes in. You do get a meatiness. There's less of a bacon flavour. I'd almost call this like a maple smoky whiskey rather than maple bacon. The bacon is quite subdued. The bacon flavour is quite subdued. And I think it's because it's not actually bacon and it's not actually flavourings. It's this yeast that they're using that gives that bacon note that it's not obvious. I like the smoke element. This is like smoked bacon, kind of barbecue gammon meat, that sort of thing, where it's more about the smokiness rather than the meatiness. But it is still there. And then the syrup comes back on the finish. And you get this mouthfeel because it's bottled at 35%. And it feels a little bit thicker as well because of the syrup element that they've added to it. You get that residue of maple syrup, but again, light maple syrup, not sickly, not sugary, but sweet enough that it gives you that, you know, really nice kind of like slightly charred brown sugar feel to it as well. I think this is amazing. They pitch it at kind of like making an old fashions, but also pouring over pancakes. Now, 35%, this poured over pancakes for breakfast, that will certainly wake you up and also make you a bit sleepy in the morning. But I really, really get why they're kind of pitching that. There's so much going on in this. It won't be for some people. It will be way too sweet because this is closer to a liqueur. Because of the syrupiness that's in there. It's going to be too sweet. It's going to be too weird. I've given samples to some people that have been in the shop since I've come back, and it's absolutely split the room. Some people have gone, oh, this is absolutely amazing. And other people have gone, nah, it's not for me. And I get that. I absolutely get that. But I think this is brilliant. This is unlike anything I've had before. I love the process behind it. I love the fact that no bacon's used, and yet it still tastes of smoky bacon. And I have actually got in touch with Iron Smoke to say, do you have any UK distribution? I don't think you do because I've never seen you in there. But if you don't, are you interested? I have some contacts because I could see this selling really, really well over here. I just don't know what the price point would be with import duties and taxes and all of that lot. But I couldn't not put this on. As soon as I saw it, and I knew I was going to put a box together of some interesting things, I could quite easily have done a box just of flavoured whiskies, and that did cross my mind because there are a lot of flavoured American whiskies out there, and there are a lot of different flavours that we could have had a box of a different flavour. One peanut butter, the maple bacon, the apple pie, the peach, all various bits and pieces. But nah, it didn't really grab my attention. But when I saw that, I was like, no, I have to put this in this box. You know, we'll have 5 regular whiskies, as it were, even though these are all a little bit quirky and a little bit different. But I need to put this one in because it turned out that the guy that I was talking to at the ABC, I'd already picked it up off the shelf, and I was paying for it at the time. We were talking about peanut butter whiskies, and he said, oh, actually, you know, we've got this flavoured whiskey. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a maple bacon whiskey from called Rattlesnake Roses. And I was like, oh, I've literally just picked it up and I'm about to pay for it now. So even on the recommendations of the guy at the liquor store, who really knew his stuff, was really, really impressed. I think this is brilliant, and I wish I'd have bought more bottles of it. Because I think this is great stuff. It's interesting, it's quirky, it's funny, it's stereotypically American, but in a really, really good way, and it's doing it properly. It's not artificially flavoured, it's actually doing a flavoured whiskey that is doing something authentic to produce that flavour profile. I love it. I love it. It's so bonkers. It's so bonkers and so American, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. You, however, might think completely differently, and I get that. That's not a problem. So that is the exclUSives box, the US exclUSives. If I can get out to the States any earlier, then I'll do probably the same again, because I think it was really good to be able to kind of give people a chance to try some unusual stuff that you can't get in the UK. But unfortunately, it might be not until next year. Hope you've enjoyed it. Do let me know what you think. I'd be really interested to see your thoughts in terms of whether the Cleveland needed water added, whether you like the maple bacon, what you thought of the Amador, because I think that's probably the most unusual in terms of the flavour profile outside of Rattlesnakes. Whether you thought that Chardonnay cask worked. And hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to have another box at some point that will be in exclusives too. So thank you very much for watching. And there are some more selection boxes coming out pretty soon, which will probably have a similar accompanying video. So if you did watch this while you were drinking the samples, let me know if it worked for you. Rather than doing like a structured tasting event on a particular date, I was thinking this is maybe something to do a little bit different. So any feedback on this kind of content with a box type thing would actually be really good to know as well. So please do get in touch. And I shall see you at the next video. Cheers.